The lyric sequence builds on Bialosky's powers of perception, her sharply observant eye, but amplifies a tonal resolve that feels critical to this moment where ethnic hatred and violence persist, as do memories that haunt and have long animated the poet's imagination, as well as her relationship to language. With Asylum, I marvel at the gathering coherence and momentum of music and insight that unifies disparate themes and even time periods in Asylum. In the presence of autobiographical material, the wonder here is Bialosky's ability to offer glimpses and measures of understanding that implicate our individual journeys. This is the result and domain of a poet through hard-won mastery over both her material and the crafting of poems transcends fashions and the cult of subject matter alone as the basis of poetry. She sings beautifully, she sings loud, and she sings with great urgency. I'm so happy to hear Jill read from her new book, Asylum.
Oh, thank you, Major, so very much. I want to echo Major in saying how delighted I am to be doing this event sponsored by the Fine Arts Work Center, and thanking Kelly and Naya for arranging this. I'm thrilled to be reading with Gail, and to be just fully transparent, Major is a very good friend, but he is also an author of mine at Norton, and I've worked on his last 3 books. Is that correct? 4. So anyways, I'm going to read from, because the book is a really one long poem in these 103 lyric sections, I created a sequence called Thrive, which wrestles with suicide and survival. And that is one of the threads the book investigates. And the sequence was published by Granta, so it makes it easy for me to know what to read, which is always so hard, I think, in giving a poetry reading. You'll hear some voices of other poets in the sequence, some lines from Dante's Inferno, translated by Robert Pinsky, a line from Plath, and also Wordsworth. Together we circled the rings. A boy, he was still learning, and we moved slowly, picking up rhythm as we traveled. We would see it all, digging our blades to find traction, balance, to free the mind of doubt, falling, occasionally bumping up against the outer edge. It would take years if we were lucky, stumbling in the face of reason. Oh muses, oh geniuses of art, oh memory, our blades crushing the ice. I knew by then that anything was possible. Once we witnessed a child's cheek nearly cut out from another skater's blade during a fall as he swerved in and out of the skaters, the triple axle of envy, gluttony, and pride igniting their hearts. Always someone who wanted to outdo another. We had to witness all of it because it had already happened. I had to be vigilant, cautious. Sometimes I held his hand tight because I knew. We kept our heads down. We were entranced, focused. Sometimes we could not see anything before us. That's what it required. 1 year I had forgotten the first leaves of spring. I had forgotten all the years of toil. I looked up and trees had flowered. All it took was waiting out the bleak winter, the hemisphere of darkness. The color was lime green. I wanted to tell her, this is what it's like. like just awakening, drenched, they persist, ghosts in our poems, ghosts in our imagination, ghosts in our waking hours, ghosts who elude philosophers, poets, scientists, psychiatrists, who perpetuate, who guileless will not keep quiet, who preside over the populace and unknowingly rob the living, ghosts who made their own house be their gallows, Dante says, will never rest. Under microscope magnifying glass, using magnets and electricity, pin and tuning fork, lumbar punctured, photographed, sketched, hypnotized, documented, compared, analyzed, tortured, starved, etherized, objectified, and concretized, held prisoner by the perpetrators of a science, by the history of an era, by the myth of the unsolvable math of the mercurial mind. Daffodils, survivors of the cruelest month, tossing their heads in sprightly dance, from the ground arise, beautiful long spines and yellow crowns, tulips, class flower, hues fancied a fox, too excitable, too red. What we thought would thrive, we found a family of fragile evergreens we had planted one year, bottom needles eaten out by starving deer. One we had to tie to a stake to keep steady and alive. Like the snap of a branch, like the terror of the wind, like roots dug up, like worms in their undergrowth, like the rat on the pavement smashed by the wheels of a car into an inconceivable pancake, like the inexplicable act of making a noose, hanging it from the ceiling and tightening it around the neck, like the argument in a forest, like a person who knows things, a person who can't forget, a person who probes, persists, and is unkind, like the mind hating itself, like the wind giving in to logic, like thought murdering the body, like the night when the resilience of lavender, woody, spiky, tucked in the corner where deck meets earth, gave up and failed to thrive. Because it was Christmas and I was home with my fiancé, because her eyes burned with the brightness of knowing and barely a fleck of gloom, because she was young and brave and still wore cheap and sexy dresses in which only she made elegant, and though she sometimes came home intoxicated and vomited from drink and wept alone, suffering from the human syndrome of need, want, and abandon, she still slept wearing a Bugs Bunny sweatshirt, made us all scrambled eggs, nursed her beloved cat, gossiped with girlfriends on her phone, and slept stone cold into the morning like Sleeping Beauty, awaiting a kiss in a room under a vaulted ceiling of a synagogue of the holy and depraved, where I too once slept in the cradle of despair and rage. Because gods are threatening to tear down branches, uproot trees, because there is no reprimand, recourse, no release, rain unleashes in downpours, wind casting for answers, for crimes committed, souls humiliated, denied passage, denied rest. There is no end to the flooding, no end of grief. In downpours, rain is unleashed. Just one more. Sorry, I've lost my place. There's just two more little sections. What did I do here, Jill? Metamorphosized into trees that for eternity bleed, if cut or pruned or preyed upon, forever cast into hell's seventh circle, the lip above the chasm of pain, which holds the din of infinite grief, unable to settle neither in heaven nor the underworld, the self-slaughtered. Hinduism considered it soul murder, Muslims hellfire, and in the eternal life forever to inflict us with pain. Aristotle considered self-murder a crime against one's country. Jews denied a proper burial, and for your lifeblood I will require a reckoning. There is no logic too divine, no pleasure or pain greater than human stain. A drawer of junk jewelry, combs and brushes, sweatshirts, maid of honor dress, wrapped in cellophane and stored like shadows in the closet's hinterland. Diary with crushed pressed flowers, drawn red hearts, confessions, hopes, dreams, ink bleeding on onion skin, thin as leaves, novels with pages flagged, postcard of Mexico I once sent, lock of hair sealed under glass, of the rashness, impassioned, forsaken, forever bemused, a life mask made of strips of paper mache, as if to mock the dead's eternal masquerade. Thank you. Thank you. Here's a copy.
I'm going to share that cover along with while I talk. That was Jill's reading from her book, Asylum. And as you can hear, it's a sequence poem. And I think you can hear the kind of momentum of power that this book exhibits. And I'm really excited to talk about it in the latter half of this presentation.
Thank you, Major.
And Gail Mazur is the founding director of the Blacksmith House Poetry Series and the author of 6 previous books of poems, including They Can't Take That Away From Me, finalist for the National Book Award. She is the author of the forthcoming book, soon to publish, Lands End, New and Selected Poems. She has won fellowships from the National Endowment for the Arts and the Bunting Institute of Radcliffe College, as well as the St. Botolph Club Foundation Distinguished Artist Award. Gail Mazur has long gained authority in her poems by rendering herself both vulnerable and luminous. One for whom phenomena, as well as the actions of others, are absurdly, hysterically inscrutable, but also two, one for whom bewilderment leads to a kind of majestic clarity. Typically two, Gail is downright funny, observant, one whose humor cannily disarms as she exercises a reflexive intelligence that, as Sandra Gilbert once wrote about her, examines her own history by examining the largesse of history. Such is the case with her new book, Lands End, soon to publish later this month. Having read and heard these poems over the past several years, I am moved by the scope of her life and letters that take us into realms of love, grief, loss, Jewish identity, family, justice, and her persistence of being in one's art as a form of survival. Over her long, distinguished career, Gail Mazur is equally treasured as both an advocate and mentor and friend of poets and artists, and I am delighted for her to read her poems this evening. Thank you, Gail, for joining us today.
Thank you. Is my voice on?
Yes.
Yep. Okay. Thank you so much, Major, and thank you, Jill, for that profoundly moving reading. I can't wait to get the book. Unlike mine, it's probably out, right?
Just now. Thank you, Gail.
Yeah. I'm going to read, since I don't have physically my new selected, I'll be reading from pieces of paper and other books. I'm going to start with a poem, which was actually the first translation I ever wrote, and it's of a very famous poem by Michelangelo, which he wrote to his friend Giovanni da Pistoia while he was working on the Sistine Chapel. And if you've seen the movie, you know it was physical torture. And it's funny because that came from Michelangelo's poem. It's called Michelangelo to Giovanni da Pistoia, when the author was painting the vault of the Sistine Chapel, 1509. What's really stunning is how nakedly anguished it is for a 1509 poem by a great artist and a great poet. I've already grown a goiter from this torture, hunched up here like a cat in Lombardy or anywhere else with the stagnant water's poison. My stomach squashed under my chin, my beard's pointing at heaven, my brain's crushed in a casket, my breast twists like a harpy's. My brush above me all the time dribbles paint, so my face makes a fine floor for droppings. My haunches are grinding into my guts. My poor ass strains to work as a counterweight. Every gesture I make is blind and aimless. My skin hangs loose below me. My spine's all knotted from folding over itself. I'm bent taut as a Syrian bow. Because I'm stuck like this, my thoughts are crazy, perfidious tripe. Anyone shoots badly through a crooked blowpipe. My painting is dead. The Sistine Chapel, dead. My painting is dead. Defend it for me, Giovanni. Protect my honor. I am not in the right place. I am not a painter. So it's some comfort. It's some comfort to see doubt at that level. The next poem is called Figures in a Landscape. And it's addressed to my husband, Michael. We were two figures in a landscape in the middle distance in summer. In the foreground, twisty olive trees, a mild wind made the little dry leaves tremble. Then, of course, the horizon, the radiant blue sky. The maker was hungry for light. Light silvered the leaves, a stream. I like to think for your sake, the scene was Italian, 17th century. Viewed from here, we resembled one another, though we were unalike. And we were tiny. He'd kept us small, so the painting would be landscape, not anecdote. We were made things, deftly assembled, but beginning to show wear. You muscular, sculptural, and I was I. We were different. We had a story. On good days, we found comedy in that, pratfalls, and also great sadness. Sun moved across the sky and lowered until you, then I, were in shadow, bereft. The Renaissance had ended. We'd long known we were mortal. In shadow, I held the wild daisies and cosmos we'd been gathering for the table. Then the sky behind us pinked and inflamed the landscape where we were left to our own reinvention. Two silhouettes who still had places they meant to travel, who were not abstractions. Had you pricked them, they'd have bled, alizarin crimson. I wanted to walk by myself a while, but I'd always been afraid to lose you, and the naked olive groves were hovering as if to surround you. That was the problem. I craved loneliness. I needed the warmth of love. If no one looks at us, do we or don't we disappear? The landscape would survive without us. When you're in it, it's not landscape, any more than the horizon's a line you can stand on. And I'm going to read one poem from Forbidden City, also addressed to Michael. And the anecdote about the Japanese artist Hokusai is really true and was a favorite artist story. Mount Fuji. Hokusai and Hiroshige, my first presents to you, 2 linen-bound books that closed with loop ribbons and faux ivory clasps. Decades later, we gaped at Fuji from a window of Japan Air and gasped together in Narita, a park so immaculate, white rocks gleamed graphic in a river of gravel. Later still, you'd move between the floating worlds of ukiyo-e woodcuts and Chinese landscapes, whose surfaces entered you as if it had been faded. A draftsman's draftsman, Hokusai at 70 thought he'd begun to grasp the structures of birds and beasts, insects and fish, of the way plants grow, hoped that by 90, he'd have penetrated to their essential natures. And more, by 100, I will have reached the stage where every dot, every mark I make will be alive. You always loved that resolve, you repeat joyfully. Hokusai's utterance of faith in work's possibilities, its reward, that at 130, he'd perhaps have learned to draw. In Edo then, his beloved Fuji was seen as the true source of immortality, as for him it was to be. Will you always give me such spectacular gifts? You asked me that day when we were 20. I'm going to read 3 new poems, if it's not too greedy, from the new section of Land's End. This poem is called At 4 a.m. And I don't think I have to explain anything, including who Mike Tyson is, but he was a champion boxer who really messed up his life and sort of came out the other side. At 4 a.m. Some people have an appetite for grief, Emerson wrote. And years ago, reading that, I thought, not me. Though I knew what he meant, I'd known people to default to it, people married to woe, dumbfounded by any sort of merriment. Still, I thought our venerable sage judged some people harshly from his conquered manse, where character meant transcending the insane pull he'd known when widowed young he nearly died of grief, of rending rage. Non-negotiable loss, we know some people seem to thrive on it. They can't be coaxed into the light. Lightheartedness won't touch them or delight. Its hum negligible and irritant, a cloud of gnats to brush away. Did lofty Emerson disdain them for frailty of spirit? No, but he was done with it. that first loss tempering him oddly into calm for the losses that would come, the calm that said, grief can teach me nothing, not me, not now. I know day when it wakes me can bring back endless night. Even here, long uncompanioned or companioned by grief and joy, the he in me. I hunger for laughter, for touch, for tears my hand can brush away. My work now, to continue learning to absorb the loss and live. Is that work enough? How can I know who or what can help me learn? I'm a peasant, a humbled Mike Tyson said. At one point, I thought life was about acquiring things. Life is totally about losing everything. For a fighter, a violent man, that's knowledge hard-earned, whose things were bulwark against self-loathing and despair. It's clear he knows now things can't be enough. But I don't care what Tyson knows or don't know why I care. Does his abrasive, cleansing knowledge touch me? Yes. Or is it its devastating articulation? Living on here, I have what I have, an acceptance of loss that disappears in dreams, in excruciating replays of a life draining away. These visitations, like falling trees unsummoned, come. My night, a crushing yesterday, the lit bed light won't erase or wish away. And my last poem is the title poem, although not exactly the title, of my new book, Land's End. It's called At Land's End, and it's set in Provincetown, where when I came here, Stanley Kunitz and Dugan were the sort of father figures in entirely different ways to the poetry community that founded the Fine Arts Work Center and kept it going, and where I was overjoyed to meet Major when he came as a fellow. And Stanley was famously a great gardener. At Land's End. This garden, it's descendant of Stanley's anemones, flowing, pearlescent, like the nacre of shells, their offspring mine now, in my yard, fragile, beside the orange blare of Dugan's trumpet vine. My almanac of inheritances swanning around my own bee balm and butterfly bush, monarchs and black swallowtails fluttering, a sunflower bowing its great human head toward the sun. The garden's heart, the lilies, its consoling perfumes, the richesse of memory. What would they say today, I wonder, our old ones? Stanley, ancient and clear-eyed, ready to jump into action, and Dugan, irascible, a furious activism far in his past, removed, really past caring about much, yet somehow bracing, abrasive. There, our century long over, and today's news preposterous, still somehow unthinkable, a savage clown at the helm, breaking the toys of the circus he never liked anyway. Every treasure, every human pack tossed aside as if they were created to be broken. Playthings of the world, mortal, uprooted. Oh, Stanley, tending your cultivated dune under the sun of justice, wiry, undefeated, feeding your annual seedlings. One late afternoon long ago, a little too early for martinis, you lay down your clippers on warm flagstone by a withering clump of weeds. Gail, you said, grabbing my wrist, urgent, what are we going to do about Bosnia? Where did it come from? Where does it go? That sense of agency. You, so ready to drop your tools, compost the cuttings, Compost your newspapers for the garden's future, the Times, the Globe, as if here at Land's End, here on the coast, urgent, together we'd have energies to do battle forever, as if we could rescue the guttering world. Thank you. Thanks.
I'm going to put up a picture of, for a second here, Gail's book, which features a painting by the late Michael Mazur, her husband, and I encourage you to purchase it in advance along with Jill's new book, Asylum. I have just several questions, and I hope they are, I hope you find them intriguing and generative. And these questions were written after reading your works, going back to some old favorites, in Desire. I think I have Subterranean over there too. And then I reread your new poems. And so I hope this kind of connects with you. Gail and Jill, both of your poems, much hinges upon the commonplace. There's a kind of texture of the everyday in your work, but also the luminous aspects of your lives. For you, Gail, you write about baseball, apple trees, turnips, fallen boxing champions. And Jill, you have these wonderful worms in the undergrowth, Bugs Bunny t-shirts, onion skin thin as leaves, first leaves of spring. And I'm curious about, when you're writing, how much attention do you give to the physical world around you, and yet find these utterances like, if no one looks at us, do we or don't we disappear? Or in one poem, Jill, you asked, which I thought was quite cheeky and quite clever, is it the chaos of God's will? And those kind of utterances kind of elevate us beyond the commonplace. So I'm curious about when you're writing, how do you achieve that kind of attention and balance?
Jill?
Well, I'll give that a little try, Major. You know, I think when I came to poetry, it was during that time of the image poem, when I was in a junior in college, and my teachers at that time were very focused on images. And so for me, you know, the image is something that always pops into my mind when I recall a memory, or when I, you know, just drift into some kind of mysterious stream of thought. But I like how these, as you call them, commonplace images, you know, they're concretized in some way, and I think they're important for the reader to be able to envision and latch on to the poem, and allow the poet, I think, to, you know, occasionally go deeper into some sort of spiritual realm. That's, I guess, how I would answer that. Gail, yeah. What do you think? How's for you?
It's probably we're probably variations of the same. The homely details have always been the stuff of life to me. And the challenge with the poem is to push it a little harder. So, I mean, sometimes it's not a challenge because you're lucky and it just comes naturally. But I seem to always want to find what transcends the ordinary, but in the ordinary. It's probably, you Major mentioned my baseball poem. That would be like, to me, that's an ecstatic poem. It's tragic and ecstatic. And I think, I think that may have been the first poem I wrote that I felt really great about. Like, I not only had done what I would have wanted to do, but I wouldn't have even known I wanted to do it. It was a spell, really. But it starts with being grounded in the real world.
Yeah, yeah. I also, speaking of, that's, someone said seeing is personality. And I think that's definitely true in poetry. What we choose to see and how we see is a condition of our own kind of personal lives and the art that we've encountered, the poems we've encountered, the conversations that are there, but also our kind of bodily relationship to the world. But then there are moments that that implicate all of us. These, whether we're talking about in your book, Jill, the Tree of Life massacre in Pittsburgh, or you're writing, Gail, quite beautifully about your uncle and I think Michael's uncle, and the Stalin Trotsky debate, writing about being a student when beat poetry was emerging. So these are like public narratives that you kind of lend your imaginative interpretation of those moments. And Jill, I just found those poems so full of music, a kind of a necessary music. And Gail, your poem, that poem is so poignant to me and yet so personal. So I'm thinking also about, there's a certain kind of trepidation in writing about certain moments for fear that it may date the poems. And I was just curious, maybe for readers, how do you go about writing about these large moments, like we find ourselves in another moment now, maybe as we say, unprecedented, and thus a certain demand on the language and on us as writers?
Well, I think I'm sort of amazed. I finished the poem about Stanley and the guttering world.
Yes.
Oh, well over a year ago. I mean, maybe before Trump was even elected. I don't know, but when I went to read it today, thinking of reading it, I thought, you don't have to transcend much now to get into extremes. To get into extremes of feeling, and then to find somehow, for me, some solace in the old, even self-styled wise man of Provincetown, I mean, to be frank, to be Stanley.
I would, Asylum, I began the poems in this book really, I think, in 2016. And I didn't really, I was actually following a very different thread initially, which was exploring becoming a poet, and thinking back to language. But then the world became so despairing that these voices began to enter into Asylum. And I really felt that we were at this moment, and we still are to a certain extent, where I fear for the human spirit. There are so many crushing, devastating acts of violence and racial extremists, and now we have the pandemic, not to be depressing. But the truth is that I think Asylum really became this poem for me that was really trying to hold on to how the human spirit survives in turmoil and in, grief. And Gail, I really loved that one line in one of your poems, that grief can teach me nothing. Anyways, I don't know if I'm answering the question.
No, you are. You are.
But
you are.
I feel that we need poetry more than ever right now. As you,
Yeah.
I know you feel that way, and I know Gail does too.
Yeah, yeah. Those the title of the book is Asylum, which suggests a certain kind of protection. And I've been thinking increasingly about the voice that faces these large moments, and the necessity of that, for lack of a better word, that kind of witnessing. And that's what I detect. There's such a fragility to the human spirit right now that could be easily crushed by these moments. We all stand bewildered. And it's great when you can encounter poems that have a certain kind of clarity. I also noticed this in both of your works. I find poems full and embodied, ode to some of the poets that you are in conversation with, that you've mentioned, works of art, personal history, that layer with all manner of implication and suggestion. And I was just thinking about who are the voices and the poets that that you feel we are, to be straight, to say this straight, whose voices are necessary, and that we are at risk of losing them to time, and losing them to the layering of more and more poetry that emerges. Who do you think we need to resurrect at this moment, whether you find their poems relevant or not?
Wow. Emily Dickinson.
Fair enough.
I mean, because she's famous, but she's actually hard. She's not gratifying, and she's really, she's a touchstone for a lot of people.
That's true. With my editor's hat on, I edited 2 recent sort of slant biographies of Emily Dickinson. Martha's book. Yeah. And she's always with me, Emily Dickinson. I find myself sometimes just, quoting in my head one of her lines, I'm nobody, who are you? When I'm feeling really down. But yes, yeah. And hope is the thing with feathers, of course. Yeah, she's just amazing. I found when I was working on Asylum that, Dante's Inferno became very important to me, and I kept going back to it. And also Paul Celan, who I echo in the book. And I would mention one of my poets at Norton who passed away last year, Stanley Plumley, only because he was my first teacher. And this is his new book that's coming out in August. So I wanted to give a shout out to a beautiful lyrical poet who I think needs to be read.
Yes, indeed. Thank you. I'm going to turn it over to, there's a question This is from Susan Mitchell, who says, first, wow, was so deeply moved. What a deep joy to have been moved to tears. This is a question for Jill. When did your book length sequence begin? When were you in the thick of it? And when did the writing of it end?
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Susan, so much. I'm such an admirer of your work. I'm glad that you're here. I think that my the book began around 2016, and I would say that it continued to evolve to my editor's despair. Even after I turned it in, I just kept reconfiguring or going. My process is really strangely, you know, how certain sections of a poem begin to talk to each other, and I was trying to, you know, really absorb those connections, and so it kept evolving, and to the very end. But it was a really interesting process, and I'm glad that I gave myself permission to just follow the threads. Yeah.
I asked, this is your second New and Selected. How was Zeppo's first wife different from Land's End and the culling of those poems?
Well, that was really hard, I have to say. It wasn't exactly my idea to do that. You know, there is a sense that telling yourself those books still exist doesn't really help, you know, because who's going to see them that hasn't already seen them?
Right.
It's sort of off the shelves. So I just had to, I had to be tougher on the earlier work. I had to sort of try to make it a book, you know, not and then I wrote, and then in this book I did that. And I see themes that got stronger, partly because of my what happened in my life, you know, the whole desire to sort of incorporate the plastic arts into my sense of the poem, to talk about it, because I didn't have the same person to talk about it with anymore. But I felt really enriched, you know, that my work was enriched by what I learned from living with an artist, and which somehow I think in Michael's life, sort of mostly I let that was that turf. But I wanted to, and I just, it wasn't a deliberate thing. I wanted emotionally to incorporate it, and to keep the relationship of the visual arts in my life, to keep it there, not to sort of feel that it ended with my husband's death. It was, and then doing the other hard part was the new part, which I really cut back because I was having such a hard time cutting. Like, how do I take selections from two books that I've published in the last 10 or 12 years, you know, which I selected when I wrote them. It was easy, and then it wasn't easy, and then it was sort of like, remember the game we used to call 52 pickup, which was where you threw a deck of cards in the air and you had to pick them up. That was a little bit what it felt like, cutting back some of them to try to make it a volume, coherent, and to see the difference. I looked at a lot of selecteds and collecteds, and they're all different. Even the order and time, you know. I tend to go from the new poems to the old because I'm so interested in the new poems right now.
Right. Two more, and then I'll ask you two to kind of close with a poem. Laura Flegel thanks both of you for your enormous gift. And also, in addition to longing to see her mother and sister in person, she's wanted to gather with poets. But she also asked this: where are we? Where are each of us? I'm in Burlington, Vermont.
Oh, I'm in Cambridge, Massachusetts.
And I'm on the eastern shore of Long Island.
Great, thank you both.
That was easy.
Yeah, exactly. Lisa Frenette says, hi, Jill. I love what you read, particularly from the Thrive section. The resilience of lavender. One year I'd forgotten the first leaves of spring. And one of my favorite lines, the unsolvable math of mercurial minds. Mm-hmm. She asks, who are you reading now? And how are you making sure you thrive during the pandemic?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you know, what's happened to me through this pandemic is that I've been listening to books on tape because I've been taking a daily walk to get out of the house and out of, you know, I'm working full time at the office remotely, so I'm on the computer all the time and reading. So I've been listening to audiobooks, and I've been listening to classic work. So I listened to all of E.M. Forster's books, which I loved, just transported to a totally different time and place. And then Virginia Woolf, Nicole Kidman reads To the Lighthouse and Mrs. Dalloway, and I just so recommend both of those, just hearing her voice and those words. So that's what I've been doing. I really have had a hard time concentrating on, aside from the work I do of editing, of reading right now, which is, I don't know why. It's concentration, maybe.
Gail, might I ask you a similar question? What are you doing right now to steady yourself, and how are you thriving during this moment?
Well, I would say about my reading, it's high and low. So, because when I really can't concentrate, I read mysteries. But one of my favorite books is one of the books that Jill published, Martha Ackman's book on Emily Dickinson.
These Fevered Days, the title escaped me first.
Days.
Yes.
Yeah. And then I just picked up my Antonia again.
I love that.
You know, because I thought maybe Willa Cather is what I need now, not Jack Reacher.
All right. Why don't we end with a short poem to end this evening by each of you. And Jill, I'll ask you to go first if you don't mind.
Sure. This is one of the sections from Asylum. The winter where the sparrows quieted, in which the snow would not stop, in which the rats would not come out, in which we feared for our safety and snow covered the bereft shrubs. Homeless, here I am you, sought shelter, fearful stockpiled water and provisions. The winter, a strain of virus quarantined us far into spring, in which another teenager somewhere in the city is locked in a sephoric fog, helpless, forgotten, isolated in aloneness, landscape shrouded in an unreasonable mask. Winter of the symphony's grand crescendo, seats of council, judges assemble to form a decree. Citizenry run amok is not a matter of the individual, but society. Timpani, cymbals, snare drum, family of percussion. Thank you.
I'm really, really excited for this. Thank you. Gail?
I'm going to read a poem called Hall Mirror. And as you mentioned, Major, the generations of and my uncles were both communists. And my uncle's name happened to also be Rosenberg. Anyway, Hall Mirror. Federal style, 2 small chips in the gilt frame, found at a flea market in the Eisenhower 50s. 19th century American, lovingly refinished, loving gift of my mother. It's too good for you, so take care of it. Some winter mornings here, the taut lit face of Ethel Rosenberg, or the ecstatic face of Blake, Punim of my 6-year-old grandmother, arriving stunned and mute from Vilna, her big sister Lena waiting, who knew what was at stake. Oh, my fierce mother, sanding away at the kitchen table, protected by newspapers that herald the forward traveler. Her little brush, her jar of paste, preserving and inventing the past. For what? For me. For today, half-conscious glimpse of myself on my way out for a walk in February snow with a friend or alone, my blue woolen hat, my mirror smile.
Thank you both. Thank you, Jill. Thank you, Gail. I'm a huge plug for both of your books, and wish both, publishing a book in a time of pandemic. You don't want to talk about it, but one hopes that all 51 people on will go out and publish.
Yeah.
Thank you both so much.
And also, Major, you published your new book, The Absurd Man, in the beginning of the pandemic. So a shout out to you too.
Thank you, friend.
Yes.
It's like swimming against a big wave.
Oh, that was the hardest part.
Well, thank you. Kelly, take it away.
Oh my gosh, I want to echo Susan Mitchell's wow. What a beautiful night. Thank you for your amazing, moving poems. Thank you for taking us into the process of creating them. Yeah, what a gorgeous night. Thank you so much. We invite you to get copies locally at East End Books in Provincetown of Jill Bialosky's Asylum, Gail Mazur's Land's End, new and selected poems, which you can pre-order, and Major Jackson's The Absurd Man. East End Books will ship nationally. If you live on the Outer Cape, they'll deliver them to your house. Yeah. So thank you again, Jill, Gail, and Major. What a beautiful
Thank
night.
you, everyone who attended.
Thank you for joining us.
Yes.
Good day.